Right, I've now finished the different generation algorithms for all the different kinds of ships. I've also kind of done a day of fixing things to do with them, like glitches had no windows, most factions had no heat sensors, and there was some weirdness about the placement of thrusters on Foundry ships that I've since made nice. And now I'm sort of done with like the features, the sort of list of things I had to do, but as I suspected, I can see lots of problems. I mean, actually, that day of fixing was all the problems that were not covered by what I thought I had to do. And the biggest one is segments. Segments are the sort of security zones, and the idea is each one should be self-contained and fit on the screen. And the new generation algorithms do not fit well with that. Not all of them anyway. And the way it works for all ships at the moment, but this was designed for Foundry ships. Its Foundry ships are rectangular, so it divides them into rectangles. And it has to divide all ships into rectangles because that's the shape of your screen. That's what we're trying to fit it to. And so the question of like all these exotic new shapes that I've made, how do they divide into rectangles? And they don't have to be equal size rectangles. There's no huge problem with them being small. The only problem with it is that that often doesn't give you enough kind of room to move around hazards and kind of come at it from different angles. But that's okay for like, some sectors on a ship. Segments, God. Really regret having a thing called a sector and a thing called a segment. So it would be okay if there's a couple of them. So basically what I'm saying is like if the way you break an off-world ship, the sort of V shape into rectangles, involves like 3 good sized rectangles and then a couple of little like wibbly bits, then those wibbly bits are not a huge problem. In fact, I'm sort of thinking, I don't know if this needs to be a new concept in the code, but I'm thinking of the idea that some things might not be in a segment. So the concept of segments would be, here's the big rectangles it divides into, and if there are a couple of modules that don't fit into that, those just become kind of, they don't have to be their own segment. There's 2 options. One is like, we just forget about the segment system for them, and so we don't lock them off from the big rectangles that they're joined to. That would be nice. But we also make sure that enemies are not going to be there by default. They're not going to sort of patrol into there because they will be outside of the rectangle that we're sure can fit on your screen comfortably at a good zoom level. And that is pretty easy actually. If I just don't put any terminals there, there'll be no points for the guards to patrol into those areas. That feels like the nicest solution, but I don't know how to make it off the top of my head. The solution that will already work is if I do find a good way to divide it into the biggest rectangles possible, then the bits that don't quite fit into the little tendrils would become their own zones, and those that would mean they're locked off. Yeah, that isn't going to work great because it's supposed to try and place a cluster of guards in each segment, and if that little if just one module is a segment, then it would have to have a cluster of guards in it and a keycard in it, and that's kind of ridiculous. So how could I do it in a way that allows me to kind of join those bits on? Okay, no, the question is, do I need to do that? Will I have those bits left over? Or do I modify the generation algorithm so that they don't have those bits, so that they really do divide into just big rectangles? My instinct is that's going to make quite boxy ships. That might not be true, or might not be important. It will definitely make ships more similar to each other. But that's also not that important. That's something I feel is important, and I've worked hard to make sure that the random generation algorithm makes different feeling ships. But actually, you almost never have 2 at once. Like, the game is very much, it's boiled down to just you get a ship on board which your mission is, and you go there and you do the mission and then you come back. The next time you see a ship will be several minutes later, and it may be one of a different faction, in which case it will feel radically different anyway. And if you choose to do the same faction over and over again, that's your choice. And so if that's boring, then it's your fault. There'll also be different sizes, so that'll help. So really that's not a big concern. Looking boxy would be bad, but so if you're making like a V shape out of rectangles, as long as the rectangles, like, let's say the standard size is like 5 by 3 or 5 by 4. It wouldn't be bad to have the odd one that's 5 by 2, which would be a very unusual shape and wouldn't feel too boxy, I think. So that might be fine. Anyway, so it's a little bit daunting because it's a big problem, it's important, it has to be solved, and it is a different problem for all of the factions that I've added new logic for. Foundry should be fine, they should just stay the way they work, but each of the other 3 factions have their own generation logic and will need their own logic to kind of fix how it works. My first job will be to restore a bit of code I had when I was first making the segment system, which just showed me where the segments are. Basically every module gets coloured to a segment. Each segment picks a random colour and we highlight them, and then every time I generate a ship I can just see, oh, you think that's in that sector. Technically it's possible to look at a ship without debug mode and see where the sectors are, because there's always locked doors between segments. I've said sectors again. And I'm also using zones interchangeably with segments. But that's hard to see at a glance. What you really need to see is at a glance where are the zones. And so I need to do that and see what the problems are. I guess I should pick one faction and just do them, so I'll probably do Offworld, because my instinct is that feels the most solvable. It's one where I definitely know it needs work, and I don't think the work is going to be too complex. Sovereign may not need any work. They're not rectangular, but they're made of rectangles, and so I feel instinctively that can be fixed pretty easily. I also haven't tested. I think Sovereign may just already be fine. The segment system damn nearly works with anything. You can plug a lot of weird things into it and it will cope with it. Sometimes you get a really thin segment or a really small segment, but you can still play the ship, which is nice. And also my code for just filling a ship with segments, with rooms and corridors and stuff, is really good at filling irregular shapes. It pretty much always fills everything. The only time it doesn't is if it's also trying to obey the segment system and you create an impossible situation where there's no way for it to put something in that segment that with the constraints you've given it. So yeah, Offworld first, debug mode, test it with Offworld, fix what Offworld's problems are, and maybe that'll be the task I set myself for today, and if that all goes great then I might move on to something else, but it may not. Glitches, when I get to them, I'll check it out, but it might be easier to just redo the generation logic, which sucks because I spent 2 days on that generation logic. But the original idea for how they work fits so nicely into the segment system, because they were going to be rectangles, and they were going to be, unlike Foundry, which is one big rectangle, they're going to be a series of little rectangles, so each one would be a segment, and that would fit perfectly. But I just couldn't quite figure out how to generate it that way. Again, actually, the thing that really screwed me was trying to make them different to each other. If you make them very similar, on a kind of grid of these rectangles, then it's quite easy to do that, but I kept thinking, oh, that's going to look too regular, you're always going to see the same ships. So I need all the rectangles to be of arbitrary size, and then I need to be able to make sure I fill the grid and make sure I don't terminate too early before I place a certain number of modules, and then it gets really complicated. But maybe I should just forget that and just say, okay, every rectangle is 5 by 3, and we just place them in. The only variance is maybe it doesn't have one in the middle left, and maybe it doesn't have one in the bottom right, and see how that looks. Because they'll also be visually different, they have different modules on them and stuff. So yeah, when I'll leave them till last, I think, because I want, maybe I'll just be so fucking exhausted that I won't want to mess with generation logic, and I'll just find some way to those can be fixed fairly easily, because they are just a rectangle with variance, and so I can just reduce the variance until it doesn't ever interfere with the segment system, and ensure that the segment size matches the variance? No, ensure the segment size is big enough that the variance doesn't take you outside of it. So